Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. To optimize the growth, development and health of a baby, it's recommended that they're exclusively breastfed, that is, only fed breast milk, for the first 6 months of life. And following the introduction of solid foods, that they continue to be breastfed until they're at least 2 years of age. Now, if you want to know more about the origins of this recommendation, then you can check out my video in the link below. For a variety of reasons, however, breastfeeding can be difficult for mums. And globally, only about 4 in 10, or 40% of infants, are exclusively breastfed for this duration. So researchers have been interested in identifying factors that contribute to a mum initiating and maintaining breastfeeding. And one such factor is dads. So in the current video, I'll provide an overview of the evidence showing that dads' beliefs about breastfeeding play a role in breastfeeding initiation and duration. The hypothesis under consideration is that dads' beliefs about breastfeeding play a causal role in mum's breastfeeding patterns. Researchers have tested this hypothesis in 2 ways. First, by looking at the association or correlation between dad's beliefs about breastfeeding and mum's breastfeeding patterns. And 2, by manipulating what dads believe about breastfeeding to see whether this changes mum's breastfeeding patterns. I'll discuss each type of research in turn, starting with the association between dad's beliefs about breastfeeding and mum's breastfeeding patterns. So a bunch of studies have looked at this association. As mentioned, in these studies, the hypothesis has been that dad's beliefs play a causal role in mum's breastfeeding patterns. And if this hypothesis is correct, then there'll be a correlation between these beliefs and breastfeeding patterns. In these studies, researchers typically recruit either a bunch of mums or a bunch of mums and dads and assess their beliefs about breastfeeding and breastfeeding history. For example, Swanson and Power recruited about 200 mums. And compared to mums who did not initiate breastfeeding, mums who did initiate breastfeeding more strongly thought their partner was pro-breastfeeding. For example, that their partner believed that breast milk is good for the baby, that breastfed babies are healthier, or that breastfeeding can help build a bond between mum and baby. Likewise, in a sample of about 550 mums, Scott found that mums who thought their partner was pro-breastfeeding were about 10 times more likely to initiate breastfeeding than mums who thought their partner was not pro-breastfeeding. And the results of these studies support the idea that dad's beliefs about breastfeeding influence mum's breastfeeding patterns. However, a problem with these studies is that they've only looked at what mums think their partner's beliefs about breastfeeding are, rather than directly asking what these beliefs are. However, several studies have asked dads what they reckon about breastfeeding. So Littman recruited 115 couples. And the researchers found that when dads believed that breastfeeding was good, kids were about 7 times more likely to be exclusively breastfed than if dad was indifferent or did not believe breastfeeding was good. Rempel and Rempel recruited around 300 women and assessed their breastfeeding intentions, breastfeeding behavior, and their partner's beliefs about breastfeeding. The results showed that greater intention to breastfeed and longer duration of breastfeeding was associated with more pro-breastfeeding beliefs in partners. And similar findings have been obtained in several other studies. The results of these studies, in which dad's beliefs have been directly assessed, provide converging support for the previous studies in which dad's beliefs were inferred based upon what mum thought his beliefs were. Thus, so far, the findings are consistent with the possibility that dad's beliefs about breastfeeding may play a causal role in mum's breastfeeding patterns. However, each study reviewed has only looked at the correlation between dad's breastfeeding beliefs and mum's breastfeeding patterns. And as the saying goes, correlation does not equal causation. That is, the finding that there is a correlation between dad's breastfeeding beliefs and mum's breastfeeding patterns does not permit the conclusion that these beliefs play a causal role in patterns of breastfeeding. For example, it's possible that the more mum breastfeeds, the more likely it is that dad sees the benefits for mum and baby, and so ends up with positive beliefs about breastfeeding. That is, the breastfeeding patterns causes the belief. Now, one way to determine whether dad's beliefs play a causal role in mum's breastfeeding patterns is to manipulate dad's beliefs about breastfeeding. If dad's beliefs play a causal role, then the manipulation of his beliefs will impact mum's breastfeeding patterns. And for more on how researchers try to establish causality, you can check out my video in the link below. From what I can tell, the way in which researchers have tried to manipulate dad's beliefs about breastfeeding has been through educational interventions. That is, providing dad with information about breastfeeding, such as the health benefits, will lead to him having more positive beliefs about breastfeeding. Now, it's repeatedly been shown that if dad has received an educational intervention about breastfeeding compared to not having received such an intervention, then mum is more likely to start breastfeeding and/or breastfeed for longer. For example, Maycock recruited about 700 mums and dads who were randomized into either an intervention condition that involved a 2-hour education session or a control condition that was usual care. The results showed that 6 weeks later, babies in the intervention group were about 1.5 times more likely to be breastfed than those in the control condition. Vic recruited about 500 dads, and about half were assigned to an intervention condition that involved breastfeeding education, and the remaining half were assigned to a control condition and did not receive any such education. At 6 months post-birth, about 40% of mums whose partner had been in the intervention condition were exclusively breastfeeding, compared to about 5% of mums whose partner had been in the control condition. And similar findings have been found across several other studies. Now, the problem with these studies is that the impact of the educational intervention on dads' beliefs towards breastfeeding have not been routinely assessed. So for these studies to support the hypothesis, you have to assume that the interventions are having this intended impact. Now, you can make up your own mind about whether or not that assumption is valid. Though it's worth mentioning that it's been shown that the more dads know about breastfeeding, the more positive their beliefs about breastfeeding are. At any rate, if this assumption is valid, then it looks like dads' beliefs about breastfeeding do causally impact on how mums breastfeed. So given that dads' beliefs about breastfeeding appear to impact mums' breastfeeding patterns, the question then becomes, how do they have this impact? There are many different possibilities, but a plausible one is that if dad has more positive beliefs about breastfeeding, then he may be more likely to support mum breastfeeding, which in turn impacts on her breastfeeding patterns. I'm not aware of any research that's directly tested this possibility. However, I did find research showing that 1. The more dad is pro-breastfeeding, then the more likely he is to provide breastfeeding support. And 2, the more breastfeeding support mum receives from dad, the longer she tends to breastfeed. So these kind of findings lend support to the idea that dad's beliefs impact on mum's breastfeeding patterns, because these beliefs influence the amount of breastfeeding support that dad provides. Now, if you want to know more, I have a video in which I discuss research that's dug into dads' beliefs about breastfeeding, the way in which dads try to support mums, and research showing what kind of support may result in better breastfeeding outcomes. And the link to that video is down below. But for the moment, that's it for the impact of dad's beliefs on breastfeeding. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.